Hi, I'm Lucy from Sew Essential and I'm here today with a Q&A session for you. So this is your opportunity to tailor the content and for me to answer the questions you really want to ask. So everything I talk about today is available on our lovely website, and you'll find links to our website and any of the products I mentioned below. And if you like what you see today, please like and subscribe, because every Friday I bring you a video packed full of sewing goodness. And if you can't wait a whole week, do check out our Instagram, Pinterest, Facebook accounts, where we post regularly on those as well. So let's get started with the questions. I've got some notes here because obviously I'm not going to be able to remember them all, so do bear with me if I refer to those from time to time, but I think there's some great questions here that will be of interest to a lot of people. So thank you to everybody who contributed questions previously. If you would like to ask a question, do leave your question in the comments below today, and then in the future I'll pick those up at some point and hopefully yours will get answered too. So let's get started with a question from Jan Spenno, who said, do I change the needles in my overlocker for woven and jersey fabrics? If so, do I use ordinary needles, not HSP? Her machine is a Janome. So I think there is a lot of confusion around overlocker needles. We had a good chat about this in the office, and between us we've got 127 years of sewing experience. We all use our overlockers very regularly, and we've got different brands of overlocker as well. And we all concluded that none of us change the needles depending on whether we're working with a stretch or a woven fabric. Really, it can seem like a minefield. There's lots of different types of needles on the market, but generally there's two key types, which are the ELX 705 needle. So this is an example of a prim one of those, but they're available in different brands. We've got quite a few on our website. And then there's the HSPs, what I think Jan was referring to here. It's HAX1SP, and that's an example of organ, but like Schmetz and other companies do them as well. There's a range of brands that do them. So generally, overlockers require one of these types of needles. Some of them will just take normal standard universal sewing needles, and then the only changes you really need to make are to use a larger size needle if you're working with a heavier weight fabric, and a smaller size needle if you're working with a lighter weight fabric. But the best advice I can give you is to refer to the manual. I had a good look round, I had a good route round on the overlockers on our website. We stock a really wide range, so do jump on and have a look if you're interested. Do get in touch if you've got any questions, because we're experts, we know, we're really familiar with them all. But I had a good route round in the manuals, and pretty much all the manuals, there's a page dedicated to this topic which tells you which type of needles to use for that machine, and also which size to use, and sometimes which stitch length, which stitch type, which type of thread to use based on the different types of fabric. So all the information's there for you. Sometimes as well, you'll even have a little label actually on the machine that tells you what type of needles to use for it. Be careful with certain machines. So the Janome air threader machine, for example, I know you can only use the Janome needles on that, but for the other Janome overlockers that aren't jet air threading, most of those you can use a normal sewing machine needle in those, but again it will tell you in the manual if you need a special needle. And then some of the baby lock cover stitch machines, you have to use a certain type of needle, but again it will be in the manual. But overall, you know, you don't need to change the type of needle based on whether it's a woven or a jersey. It's more you need to change the size depending on whether it's a heavier weight or a lighter weight fabric. The other thing to remember is if you're sewing with a cotton jersey, sometimes it might be better if you can sew with a universal needle on your machine to use one, because they have got a slight ball point on them, and that will push the fibres of the cotton jersey apart rather than piercing them. So you know, it's less likely to sort of be harsh on the fabric and leave marks. And Yeah, I mean, the only other advice I'd give you really, which is my mantra for everything sewing related, is just to always test on scraps as well and just make sure that you're happy with the results. But yeah, Jan, in answer to your question, I don't know what model you've got of the Janome machine. As long as it's not the jet hair threading one though, the likelihood is you could use sewing machine needles, but just double check in your manual and that you don't need a different type of needle for stretch or woven. It's more that you'll need a different size depending on the weight of the fabric, but all that information should be in the manual. So I hope that answers your question, Jan. Thank you for taking part. I've got 2 questions off somebody who's referred to as Starbean. So the first question is, when working out the fabric needed for a pattern, it usually says to allow extra for plaids and stripes, but it never tells you how much you need. Can you help? And that's a really good question. I think this throws a lot of people. So the suggestion is so that you can pattern match. So they're saying if you want to be able to pattern match, so you might have a check and you might want those checks to run across at the side seams or stripes to run across at the side seams. You might need extra fabric to be able to make that happen because you might need to cut your pattern pieces out at a certain point on the fabric so that you can get the front and the back to match up across those side seams, for example. So if you're not bothered about pattern matching, you don't care, well, you don't need to buy any extra fabric. However, if you do want to pattern match, then you will need to buy some extra. Now, unfortunately, the reason it doesn't ever tell you how much is because it varies greatly, because it depends on the pattern that you're using and also on the fabric that you're using. So for example, a pattern with 2 pieces, a front and a back, a very simple shell top or something, it's not going to be very difficult to pattern match that. But if you've got a pattern with lots of different pieces and you really want to go to town on the pattern matching, you've got princess seams and various different panels, you're going to need a lot more fabric to be able to do that because you've got a lot more pieces to cut out and try and match up. Having said that, I think as well the other thing to consider when pattern matching, and this is a whole other subject in itself, but you can drive yourself a bit crazy with pattern matching sometimes, and it is about sort of prioritising the key areas, I think, and I think lots of people would agree with that places like the centre front, the centre back, the side seams, they're a real priority where things are going to be very immediately obvious and visual, but other areas like under the arm perhaps aren't going to be as much of an issue, so just bear that in mind as well. If you've got a very, very small print, obviously that in some ways is easier to pattern match because that print repeats more frequently throughout the fabric. But if you've got quite a large print, then that can require more fabric. So that is why they don't give you a rule of thumb, because there isn't one, because there's so many different variables. However, a general rule of thumb that some people use is for separates such as a top or a skirt, buy an extra 1/2 metre, and then for something like a dress perhaps buy an extra metre. Can't guarantee that will always work out, but it's a general rule of thumb that probably works for most circumstances. And then if you want to try and be clever, there is a little bit of maths that you can do. So you could look at the pattern layout, the suggested cutting layout in the pattern instructions, the sewing pattern instructions, and you could look at how many pattern pieces run across a row. So for example, say you've got 3 pattern pieces that run across a row when you've got your fabric folded in half with the selvages matching up. And then you could measure how long the pattern repeat is. So you would just measure from the start of where the pattern begins to where it ends before it starts to repeat again. So for example, say that was 5 inches, and then you would multiply that by the number of pattern pieces. So there's 3, so you've got 3 pattern pieces running across the width of the fabric, and then you've got a pattern repeat of 5 inches. You would multiply the 5 by the 3 to give you 15, and that would tell you to buy an extra 15 inches. And then you would have to repeat that for each row on the fabric, and then you could always add an extra pattern repeat on as well, just to give you a bit more room for manoeuvre. But that will mean for each row of those pattern pieces, you've got the room there to move them up and down the fabric to get that pattern match right. So I hope that helps. I mean, I think the other thing is just to say that, you know, you are going to get wastage when you're trying to pattern match. And if you do, and you hate waste, perhaps just think about some of the ways you could use the scraps. So very often I keep the scraps or decent pieces that are left over, and I use them for things like pocket linings or waistband linings. You know, there's usually something that they can come in useful for. So that's worth thinking about as well. The other question that Starbean asked was, is it possible to put a lining in a skirt where the pattern doesn't have it? Now, this is a question I've been asked before by people, and I think I probably just need to do a tutorial on this for you. But the answer is yes, absolutely you can. If it's a skirt without a waistband, so it's literally just the skirt pieces, all you would do is cut the same skirt pieces out again in your lining fabric, and you would just sew the skirt and the lining together, right sides together, and that would create your skirt lining. So you just think of it like a facing. It's just like a longer facing. You know, an unlined skirt usually would have a facing to finish the waist seam. So instead of using a facing, you're just extending that facing really with the lining. And you would just sew it right sides together and turn it through, turn it over, and then you'd have the right side of the skirt fabric on the outside, and you'd have the right side of the lining fabric on the inside. You'd want to understitch that so that the lining didn't poke up over the edge of the skirt. The zip would be inserted the same way you would do it for a facing, so you'd insert it into the main fabric of the garment, and then you could either hand stitch or machine stitch the lining down the zip tapes inside. And then the other thing you need to consider is just to make sure that your lining is shorter than your actual skirt. So, you know, maybe an inch or so you'd want it to be, because when you sit down and things like that, you don't want the lining to be visible, or you don't want it poking out when you're wearing it. So you'd always make that lining just a bit shorter than the skirt itself. Now, if you're making a skirt with a waistband and you want to add a lining, again, you just create the skirt pieces in the lining fabric exactly the same way as you create the skirt pieces for the main skirt. But this time you would put the skirt and the skirt lining together, wrong sides together, as you want it to be when it's all sewn together. You would then open your waistband out, and you would sew the waistband in the normal way, two right sides together with the outside of the skirt, not the lining. You would stitch that together around the waist seam, and then you would turn the waistband over, and then you would be able to stitch that in the ditch to secure it, and it would cover up the seam on the lining. And then you can insert a zip into that in the usual way as well. And there is a blog post that I did a long time ago, but it's a good one. There's some good tips in there for sewing skirts, sewing zips in skirts with waistbands. So I'll put a link to that below for you as well. And I will try and get around to doing a tutorial for this one as well, because quite a few people have asked about that. But just to summarise, if it's a skirt without a waistband, sew the skirt and the lining right sides together and then flip it over. If it's a skirt with a waistband, you need to put the skirt and the lining wrong sides together, attach the waistband right sides together with the outside of the skirt, and then you put the other half of the waistband over and stitch in the ditch to secure that. A little tip there as well, sometimes when you press the inside of the waistband, when you press the raw edge under and try and stitch in the ditch, sometimes you won't always catch the fabric, and that can be quite annoying. I've done that loads of times. So a little tip to avoid that is you could just overlock or overcast stitch the raw edge of the inside piece of the waistband, and it's also less bulky as well, and then just bring that over the top and then do your stitch in the ditch, but it'll be a little bit longer, it'll hang down a little bit lower inside, so you'll be guaranteed to catch all of the fabric of the inside of the waistband. So I hope that makes sense, and watch this space for a detailed tutorial on that one. The next question I got is somebody who said they only sew with woven fabrics, don't have an overlocker, and wanted to know ways of neatening seams when making tiered skirts or dresses. So somebody suggested, she asked about French seams. Somebody in the comments suggested flat felled seams as an option. If you wanted something that wasn't too bulky, or just generally you can use an overcasting stitch on your sewing machine, you could give that a go. Obviously the fabric's quite thick, so you know you'd have to test on some scraps first and make sure it was able to cope, and you probably need to experiment with the stitch width and stitch length as well. But that's always a good way of neatening seams if you don't have an overlocker. Or the other thing you could do is you could just stitch another line of stitches closer to the raw edge of the fabric, or just beyond the actual seam itself, maybe 1/4 of an inch beyond the seam itself, and then you could trim your fabric down to just where that seam line finishes. So you'd have like parallel lines of stitches. You'd have your seam where the tiers were joined together, and then in the seam allowance, you know, I don't know, 1/4 of an inch away from the seam line itself, you'd have another row of stitches, and then you could trim down to that, and patterns quite often suggest doing that method as well. So I hope that helps. That was from Jennifer Ewart. Sorry, Jennifer. Yeah, just give you a mention there. Diane Montavon asked, when patterns ask for your waist measurement, do they want the actual waist or where I would wear the pattern? I'm very high-waisted and don't want to wear anything that high up. Well, yes, Diane, they will mean where your waistline is. So the way to find that, you can tie a piece of string around your waist, and wherever it falls naturally, that is your natural waist, and that is what the pattern will be referring to. But if you wanted to wear a skirt lower down than that, you could measure where you wanted the waistband to be, and then cut that size. However, what you would need to bear in mind that will also have dropped the hips, so they might be too low for you then. So you might need to alter the pattern pieces and actually shorten the pattern pieces then to bring the hips up to where they should be. Having said that, if you are very high-waisted, perhaps the hips would still be in the right place for you if you drop the waistband, the waist seam slightly, but you could always try tissue fitting with the pattern pieces to experiment, or just make a very rough simple toile just to get an idea of the fit would be my advice with that one. But thank you for your question, Diane. And then one last question is from Margaret Friday, who said she'd been considering making her own activewear. She doesn't have a cover stitch machine, just a regular domestic machine and an overlocker. Do I think she could roll with that? Well, yes, she could definitely, Margaret. And you could try using a hemming technique on your overlocker. However, cover stitch machines are invaluable for these sorts of projects because they've got that built-in stretch in the, they do that lovely twin line of stitching, and they've got the built-in stretch of an overlocker stitch. So, you know, they are absolutely ideal for working with things like lycra. If you do twin needling on a sewing machine, sometimes those stitches can pop. That can be an issue, especially with activewear where, you know, the fabric really needs to stretch because it's very, very close fitting. So yeah, in an ideal world, a cover stitch machine would make life a lot easier for you, give you a much more professional finish, and probably mean that, you know, it was more hard wearing your activewear. One of my friends, Melissa Fair, has actually written some books specifically on sewing activewear, and she designs her own range of patterns as well. So yeah, it'd be worth looking her up. They're called Fair Trade Patterns, FEHR. Yeah, it'd be worth looking up her books because there'd be a lot of advice there for you. The other thing is you can get woolly nylon threads, which are great for sewing with stretchy fabrics because they've got a bit of stretch and give in them. So we do this lovely range of Madeira woolly nylons. They come in quite a nice range of colours. These are all on the site, so I'll pop links to these these below as always. But that might be something that you want to consider as well. So yeah, I hope that helps you, Margaret. Good luck with sewing your activewear. And I did say one last question, but I think we can just fit the last couple in, which is somebody else asked where can I get, I'm just looking who the name was for this one, sorry, Lynn Woodall asked where can I get a thread holder board that I can see in the background, which is that one. So the answer is you can get it on our website, and I will pop a link to it below for you. So yeah, we've got a couple of different sizes. We've got that one, and then we've also got a really big one. Here, I brought that up to show you as well, and you can mount them on the wall or you can stand them up on a table, so I'll pop the link to that below for you. The threads on the stand are our 120 polyester threads, which I absolutely adore. You get 1,000 meters on a reel. They come in a brilliant range of colours. They've got a cardboard inner rather than a plastic one, which I really like as well. And because the meterage is so good on these, they're really reasonably priced, but you can use them in your overlocker and in your sewing machine as well, which is why I love them so much. So if I want a really specific colour for overlocking, but I don't want to buy like 5,000 meters of it, because, you know, I might not use it that often, these are absolutely golden. So I'll pop links to these below as well for you. And then one last question that I think will be useful for a lot of people. Somebody said they'd got a pattern for a jersey maxi dress that said she needed tricot lining for the bodice. She'd searched for stretch lining online and mostly found polyester jersey results, but she wanted to stick to viscose, which was the same as the outer fabric she was using. So could she just use a plain viscose jersey as a lining? And I think absolutely, yes, of course you could. That says Sewing Linguist, sorry, who left that question. Absolutely, why not? As long as your lining fabric's always a similar weight or slightly lighter weight than your main fabric, it's going to be fine. You wouldn't ever want a lining fabric that was heavier than your external fabric. But we've got a nice range of plain viscose fabrics on our website. I brought the navy blue up to show you, but it comes in black, white, and then there's a few sort of nice bright colours as well. And something like that would probably work really well. You could always email us for a sample and we'd be happy to send that out, and you could give it a little test. But yeah, that should work really well. We do stock a stretch lining as well, but that is a polyester stretch lining. So I'll try and remember to pop links to that below as well. So thank you once again, everybody who left me a question. I've really enjoyed answering those. I love doing these sessions. So please do leave questions below so I can do another one in the future and answer those for you. And if you like what you see today, please like and subscribe, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.